Good evening. My name is Kathleen Price, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Ms. Kelly Hyberger. Ms. Hyberger is a graduate of the University of Louisville and the McConnell Scholars Program. Currently, she is the Registrar and Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act Coordinator at the Fiscal History Society in Louisville, Kentucky. She previously worked as the Director of Cultural Resources at the San Diego Museum of Us and is Curator of Collections at the Fraser History Museum. Her work is focused on decolonizing museum practice, the repatriation of indigenous cultural heritage items, and centering diverse narratives of U.S. history and education and interpretation. Her work with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act has facilitated the repatriation of more than 330 ancestral human remains and more than 4,000 funerary objects back to their descendant communities. She has spoken domestically and internationally about the importance of decolonial stewardship and repatriation. Without further ado, will you please join me in welcoming Ms. Kelly Hyberger?
Thank you. All right. It's really good to be here tonight. I'm so excited to be back at the McConnell Center as an alumni. I had so many formative experiences here as a scholar, and it's really great now that I'm in my professional career to be able to sort of come back into the program and see a whole new generation of McConnell scholars. So I'm really excited to be here with you tonight. When I read the section of Chapter 10 dedicated to Native Americans in Democracy in America, I was really struck by some different and sometimes opposing themes that were sort of going on in Tocqueville's writing. When he writes about Native Americans, you can see a real aversion in Tocqueville for the ways that the Native population has been treated by Anglo-Americans. He's often really critical of the greed and the selfishness that he's seeing in American society and in the American people when it comes to the ways that they're taking Native lands. At the same time, he does seem to accept this theory that there's this social and cultural hierarchy that places Native people in an inherently lower position than Anglo-Americans. He shows us that there's at least a possibility that he thinks these social hierarchies are somewhat fluid. If the economic station of Native American people were different, he thinks they have the potential to be more upwardly mobile in American society, but he doesn't really seem to think that that transitions within their grasp due to a number of different factors that he outlines. We really see the way that Tocqueville privileges European ideas and culture, despite this moral criticism he has of how the American population has treated Native people. He falls into this trap of almost dismissing the behavior of the American government as the inevitable result of two worlds coming together, one superior and one inferior. And this is what happens when those two groups come into contact. I really wrestled with how to organize my thoughts for today and whether I should move sort of through the text of the chapter based on sub-themes or in more a linear fashion, and I decided to go a little bit more on sub-themes. So if you're thinking of the chapter, we're going to be jumping back and forth a little bit, but hopefully by the end of our time together today, you'll really understand sort of this vastly complex topic that Tocqueville's really sort of relegating down to just a few short pages in this larger work. So we're going to dig a little deeper around some of the common theories of race, culture, and civilization that were prominent during Tocqueville's visit to America, so that we can try to understand how his writing is shaped by the intellectual discourse of his day. And from there, we'll take a deeper look about land on the expanding western frontier of the United States and how the U.S. moved from the Atlantic coastal areas to the Mississippi River, as native land was taken by settlers as the U.S. developed farther and farther to the interior of the continent. And just note that when I quote from the text today a couple of times, I'm going to use the terminology and read the quotes as Tocqueville wrote them. But when I am talking in my own work, I'm going to be talking in more terms of like modern and culturally responsive practice and terminology. So, despite Indian policy being a heated and central issue facing the United States, Tocqueville opens his chapter by saying that he never had the time to stop and show what position these two races, Native Americans and African Americans, occupy in the midst of the democratic people that I was busy portraying. So that tells us from the very start that Tocqueville is seeing the Native American communities, Native American nations, as somehow outside of the American experience. He's seeing them as an other. He's not seeing them as embedded or ingrained in what is the developing American identity. He shows us that he finds their treatment and their miseries, that he calls it, to be very problematic, but he doesn't seem to let that dissonance interfere too deeply with his overall perception of his vision of American democracy. So I think there's two things happening here that's creating this sort of like dissonance in Tocqueville. One political and one is a little bit more social. So first of all, the political one. Let's talk about the status of Native Americans within the United States when Tocqueville was visiting. So at this time in 1830, Native Americans are not citizens of the United States. They don't gain citizenship until 1924. So they're not necessarily provided the same rights. They're not necessarily protected under the Constitution the same way. They're not allowed to settle disputes in the judicial system in the same way. They're viewed as outsiders to the American system. And the US government also treated Native American nations to at least some degree as independent sovereign entities. We see this in the way that the US government is engaging in negotiations and signing treaties with different Native nations. Treaty making, by definition, is an act between two sovereign powers. So there is some indication there that the US government is engaging with Native nations on a government-to-government level. However, after the signing of treaties, we always see the way that the US government is not really respecting tribal leadership and isn't necessarily honoring the treaties that they've signed. A lot of times the US government is working with any entity or individual that they deem worthy of speaking on behalf of the Native tribe, not necessarily working within the power structures that those tribes had set out. So the US government wanted to view power structures within Native American society as mirroring our own, with like the same sort of hierarchy relationships of power, the same sort of centralization of power, and the same sort of ways that there would be a central or authority that would control a number of like subservient tribes or clans. But that's not the way that it always worked. And we see this specifically when the United States is engaging in treaty negotiations with the Iroquois. They're negotiating and signing treaties with certain members of the Iroquois who are saying that they have the right to speak on behalf of large numbers of the Iroquois. And because the Iroquois are sort of politically dominating the Shawnee at that time, they also say that they have the right to speak on behalf of the Shawnee. And the US government officials who were negotiating these treaties just sort of ran with that and said, okay, great, we can buy all this land off of you because you want to sell it to us. When in reality, the power structure there was a little bit different. The system of decision making was a little bit different. And the US government sort of didn't do their due diligence in terms of talking with all of the Shawnee bands that should have also been represented in that treaty. So when the treaty was signed, the Shawnee refused to follow it. The Iroquois had put themselves in a position where they had signed away land that they didn't have any rights to, and sort of that crumbled, that treaty negotiation crumbled and led to actual armed conflict between the US government and the Shawnee people. We also see regularly how Native nations are violated and ignored by the US and federal state governments. In his footnote on page 518, Tocqueville even writes specifically about a Quapaw treaty in which in 1818 the Quapaws gave up 29 million acres of land for only $4,000, and they reserved a territory of 1 million acres of land. And the US government swore that they would respect that treaty and that they wouldn't encroach upon those lands, but just a few short years later, the US government expanded into that territory and coerced the Quapaw to sign additional treaties that would sign away more of that million of acres that they had previously promised to hold in reserve for the Quapaw. So there's this facade that Native nations occupy a space that allows them some degree of self-determination and self-government. But in reality, US federal and state governments viewed and treated tribal nations merely as roadblocks to growth and expansion. They were bound by the law when treaties served to take their land, but outside of the scope of that law when they were attempting to lobby for their own rights and their own agency. So within the American government, Native Americans existed in a sphere that was both within but also separate from American experience and identity. Throughout the text, Tocqueville also writes about Native Americans and Black Americans as really siloed in their own racial categories. He's able to set within this space that seems so problematic to us today because he's studying and writing in a world where these hierarchies are often accepted, not as subversive tools of racism and oppression as we might view them today, but as scientific fact, grounded in research and documented with evidence. So during his tour of the US, Tocqueville spent very little time with Native people, so his writing is really influenced heavily by the scholarship that he's consuming elsewhere. His tour is coming after centuries of a long relationship between European involvement in North America and Native nations, so there's this really wide body of academic writing and anthropological discourse about Indigenous people that Tocqueville would have certainly encountered during his own education. For the most part, these thinkers were heavily influenced by colonialism and tended to view Native Americans as primitive or savage peoples that lacked civilization and culture when compared to the European counterparts. So the prevailing academic thought of the day clearly and definitively sorted people into really distinct races that were viewed as fundamentally different from one another. There was an influential German anatomist called Johann Blumenbach who pioneered the idea in the 1770s that people could be divided into 5 varieties or races based on characteristics of their skulls. So he's not studying the brain to determine how to sort and classify people. He's studying the actual cranium. So like the size of one's head, the size of the interior of one's head would theoretically correlate to the size of one's brain. And from there, he made the jump that the size of one's brain would theoretically correlate to level of intelligence. So he embarked on a study to sort of map out and measure cranium and came up with a theory of these 5 races. That based on the size of your cranium, you could be put into one of these 5 categories, and then those 5 categories could subsequently be ranked. So his 5 categories are Caucasians, which are essentially Europeans, Ethiopians, which are Africans, Mongolians, which are Asian, Americans and Malays, which are like the Native American Pacific Island types people. It's not surprising in his racial hierarchy that he puts the Caucasians or the Europeans on top. By the early years of the 19th century, so just before Tocqueville would have been coming to America, men like a German-French anatomist named Georges Cuvier, he had taken the classification one system further, and he argued really, really strongly for this classification of both moral and intellectual faculties based on the size of your brain. And he looked for really clear indicators in the cranium that would really classify people. And this was commonly accepted within the early 19th century as scientific fact. It wasn't really viewed as much as a theory. It was considered fact. So arguments such as these, today we call them scientific racism. But these are pseudo-scientific beliefs that there is empirical evidence to support or justify racism, racial inferiority, or racial superiority. So in the early 19th century, this link between skull size and physical characteristics, like assigning someone into a racial category, and intelligence was really commonplace. And in addition, people also tried to classify people based on physical or scientific criteria. Many Europeans also believed in this theory of cultural evolution. And that's this argument that societies progress through really specific stages of evolution, with savagery being the lowest and civilization being the highest. And we can see this when we read Tocqueville's chapter, that he's pretty consistently referring to Native Americans as savages. that is about placing them within this subcategory of cultural evolution. So when he's using the term savages, he's not necessarily talking about somebody who is violent or aggressive under that sort of like definition of savage. He's talking about them as existing in this lower phase of evolution. So these hierarchies of classifying people, they're really rooted, again, in Eurocentrism. With Europeans, Tocqueville included here, really postulating theories that viewed their own societies as the exemplar of human achievement and progress. So they're really holding on to this idea that like European society is sort of the be-all, end-all example of what it means to be a civilized culture, a civilized society, and that there are stages that they have progressed through, that Europeans have progressed through over time, that Native Americans have not yet progressed through, so that they are inherently inferior in their cultural practices than their European counterparts. So within this particular schema, Native Americans were seen as existing in a less evolved stage of development than their Anglo-American and European contemporaries. So the complexity of Native social and political structures, Native technologies, Native spiritualism and religion, Native cultural practices, they were all viewed as inherently less sophisticated, inherently less developed than their Western counterparts within this cultural evolution theory that's pretty common in the early 19th century. So Tocqueville himself doesn't explicitly cite the work of Blumenbach or his proteges, but Tocqueville's writing does sort of show us when we read it that he's viewing the so-called races as wholly distinct in character. So as we read this chapter, we can really see how he's classifying African Americans, Native Americans, and Anglo-Americans in really distinct silos. And we can also really pick up on the way that he is looking at culture in the same way. He comes up several times. One of which, at the bottom of page 516, Tocqueville writes, "Among such diverse men, the first who attracts attention, the first in enlightenment and power and happiness is the white man, the European, man par excellence. Below him appear the Negro and the Indian." So that right there is just sort of showing us all of this intellectual thinking and discourse that's been happening over several decades building up to Tocqueville's visit that's really framing his worldview, framing the way that he is able to look at people in these silos. For us today, it might seem odd or inappropriate or racist to view people in these silos. It doesn't mean that it wasn't inappropriate and racist in Tocqueville's time as well, but it does show us the way that Tocqueville is being informed by scholarship within his era. He's not spending a lot of time with Native Americans. He's only spending, I think I read, it's like 7 to 10 days in contact with indigenous communities. During that time, he's not really talking to Native people to get their input on their culture. He's talking to white people who have lived embedded with Native Americans, and he's looking really heavily at the reports of U.S. congressional officials, people from the Department of War, people from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So he's getting his information about what Native American existence and culture and political structure is like from outside of that community. And we can see in the writing how all of that is being influenced by these other thinkers of his day. I want to point out that on page 516, just before his paragraph about European being the man par excellence, he's framing his classifications on the three races residing in America. He does use the terminology naturally distinct, embedded in another paragraph. So, and it's in a larger topic, not really talking about classifying the races, but his use of the term natural there, I think it's small, but it's also, it's just a single word. But I think it's really important because the term natural there is a really loaded term. It's telling us that to some extent, I'm thinking he is buying into this form of this scientific racial hierarchy of people. He is implying that there is this natural fundamental difference that is putting people into the racial categories. So at least to some degree, I think it's probable that Tocqueville is not viewing differences in economic station as a result of privilege, power, and access, but fundamentally to some extent grounded in biology and physiology. He links this cultural hierarchy with the racial hierarchy just a couple pages later when he talks about how Native Americans are attached to barbarism as a distinctive sign of their race. So he's saying that they are embedded in this lower form of cultural evolution than their European counterparts as a distinct correlation to being in this lower racial hierarchy. So I just think it's, together, these theories of cultural evolution, of scientific racism, they're building a foundation for the US government specifically to really justify subjugation, oppression, and forced removal for what they deem to be an inferior people. So the US government, the American people are looking for ways to justify the taking of native land. And in these hierarchies, they are finding excuses, they're finding reasons to sort of tell them that it's okay that they're encroaching on this land, that they're taking this space, and that they're denying Native people access to their ancestral territories. It also creates the world where Tocqueville can study democracy, he can study democratic institutions, but he can relegate hundreds of thousands of people and their experience within American democracy to about 20 pages. Because he is viewing them as this sort of fundamentally different, fundamentally inferior group of people who are fundamentally outside of this enlightened experience of democracy. So from his perspective, it makes sense not to be considering them, as he's moving throughout the entire book. So it's also widely accepted in the early 19th century that it was inevitable that Native American populations were going to become extinct. And we also see this really fatalistic point of view in Tocqueville's writing. He articulates and just laments so many things that have happened to Native people, but at the same time, I don't really see him condemning their destruction and condemning these things that are happening within the American government as strongly as I would have liked to have seen from somebody, obviously, today. But this idea that Native Americans are doomed, in large part, comes from this idea that they are so culturally and socially inferior to Anglo-Americans that their ways of life cannot be sustained in the face of an onslaught of white expansionism. So for Tocqueville and his contemporaries, the progress of civilization, the progress of modernity is inevitable. And like I said in the beginning, when you have these two groups that he views as coming together, one inherently inferior and one inherently superior, he believes that that superior cultural group, that superior racial group is ultimately going to triumph, and that is the inevitable path forward. So I want to look a little bit at how Tocqueville defines civilization and discuss and how he discusses cultural evolution within the chapter. So we can see how he describes Native populations as either within or beyond the scope of civilization. I want to point out that I also think Tocqueville's talking about Native Americans and their position is a little disjointed for a couple different reasons. He paints this idea of a singular Native experience and doesn't really dig into the nuance and diversity of Native experiences and Native nations that are being countered by the American government. He writes really strongly about the Indian and the savage. So he's creating this idea of a single entity instead of a really rich, complex system that is existent. So in reality, I think what's happening here is that by viewing Native cultural groups through the lens of cultural evolution, in which tribes, regardless of their cultural or spiritual practices, exist in a state of lower evolution, Tocqueville can talk about them as this sort of like monolithic and homogeneous group that doesn't merit the attention to really fully understand and articulate their nuances or their complex position within American democracy. So doing so, really speaking to their complexity and to their diversity, would require viewing their structures and practices as inherently more sophisticated than the racial hierarchies or the cultural hierarchies wanted to view them. All right, so back to civilization and cultural evolution. on page 530, there's a quote that I want to read to you guys. Tocqueville writes, civilization is the result of a long work of society that proceeds in the same place and that the different successive generations bequeath to one another. The next paragraph, he says, several times the attempt has been made to bring enlightenment to the Indians while leaving them with the mores of wandering people. At the bottom of the page, he goes on to say, the great failing of these legislators of the Indians was not to understand that to succeed in civilizing a people, it is necessarily, above all, to get them to settle down. And they can only do so by cultivating the soil. So it was first a matter of making the Indians farmers. Not only do the Indians not possess the indispensable preliminary of civilization, but it is also very difficult for them to acquire. So what we see in this specific passage is the really clear way that systematic agriculture, farming practices, and the white people who practice it are privileged and superior to the alleged sort of nomadic life ways of native people. Just a few pages later, Tocqueville writes, when the Indians undertake to imitate the Europeans, their neighbors, and like them cultivate the land, they soon find themselves exposed to the effects of destructive competition. The white is the master of the secrets of agriculture. So when I read this chapter, I see really intensely how these prevailing social and cultural theories of Tocqueville's era are just really saturating the way that he writes about Native Americans. It's clear that Tocqueville believes in cultural evolution. He exalts the European and Western practices and the racial hierarchy. And we have to keep this in mind when we read his insights and his opinions into the Native people at the time of his visit. For us today, we see a real dissonance as Tocqueville attempts to sort of reckon with some of these pervasive social assumptions and beliefs and the ways which the democratic government ought to function. But in all fairness to Tocqueville, he's also writing and witnessing the present state of a people who have for centuries been decimated by land loss, disease, family, and social upheaval. So there are parts of their culture that are highly fragmented, and he's seeing the results of cultural genocide that have been taking part for generations. But to really sort of hone in on farming and what that means in terms of this hierarchy of civilization, native food production systems for generations were intentionally destroyed, from the earliest decades of conflict. So it is a myth that Native Americans did not practice systematic agricultural farming. This was already a myth in Tocqueville's era. And part of that is this connection, this cultural genocide that had already been happening along the Atlantic coast and east of the Mississippi for a long time, that there had been this loss of inherent native knowledge on working the land, so that Tocqueville and his contemporaries maybe are seeing a people who don't seem to have the capacity or the knowledge or the land management for farming, but that's a direct result of a number of external factors that have been put on them, including land loss, complete decimation of population numbers, loss of elders, and the inability to pass the intergenerational knowledge down. Native Americans did not rely solely on hunting and gathering, but they had sophisticated agricultural practices that had sustained their communities for centuries. Farming practices, they varied widely across the expansive geography of what's now the United States, but a really diverse assortment of crops, including corn, beans, and squash, were widely grown east of the Mississippi River. Tribes also had practiced advanced agricultural techniques such as crop rotation and companion planting to optimize soil fertility. They also had really regionally specific and sophisticated systems for preserving and storing surplus foods. So the food systems themselves, as part of colonization, were viewed as a threat to the expansion and assimilation efforts of Euro-American agricultural interests. So we're all probably familiar to some degree with the kill the buffalo, kill the Indian practices of the mid to late 19th century on the plains. But the same mechanism essentially the same mechanism essentially existed along the Atlantic coast decades earlier, when burning crops, burning food surpluses, those were common tactics used by colonists as they attempted to drive indigenous people off of their lands. We see a lot of records of that in the archival letters and documents that are talking about early colonial expansion, specifically into Kentucky. We get a lot of that in sort of the Ohio Valley region, this massive burning of crops. So this disruption of the food system really was worsened with Indian removal around 1830 and forced relocation into Oklahoma. So as tribal nations lost ancestral territory, the displacement also meant increased loss of knowledge and access to traditional hunting grounds, fishing and gathering grounds, and the disruption of this multi-generational established food system that had included farming. In settler colonialism, another goal there is also not only to take physical control of the land, but to propagate the myth that the land was not fully utilized by indigenous people. We see this coming up in Tocqueville a couple of times, where he talks about Native American people being on the land or of the land, but not possessing the land. And a lot of that comes from devaluing indigenous connection to ancestral territory. It's done in part through saying they were just hunter-gatherers, sort of demeaning that lifestyle, when it's not an accurate depiction of Native American food systems, but it also sort of places them in a point where they don't have a strong connection to land, where they aren't dependent on a single parcel of land to support their family, and where there isn't this intergenerational connection to and dependence on land. And we really see that coming forward in this system of cultural evolution. It's really important, if you're going to place Native Americans in this bottom rung of cultural evolution, that they fit that brand. And by fitting that brand, it means that they're not farming, that they're not engaging in systematic agriculture, because that is a marker of a more civilized culture. So those myths of settler colonialism were really important to building perception and support of the taking of lands even in the 20th century. Sorry, even in the 19th century. So if we back up, way back up in Tocqueville to page 43, he writes, although the vast country just described was inhabited by numerous tribes of native, you could justly say that at the time of discovery it was still only a wilderness. The Indians occupied but did not possess it. Man appropriates the soil by agriculture, and the first inhabitants of North America lived by the hunt. So that right there is sort of Tocqueville talking about this idea that Native Americans did not farm. You own land by farming it, and because they didn't farm it, it wasn't their land. So at the same time, in the chapter on Native Americans, he really talks about how Native people possess an instinctive love of their homelands. So that's another sort of example of this dissonance where I think Tocqueville struggles with classifying people in this way. I think he sees a lot of fluidity. He, at numerous times in the chapter, calls out that he thinks Native Americans can rise above this station. They can become part of this more civilized class, but that the existing set of circumstances within America, as he saw it in 1830, was going to prevent them to do it. So all at once you're seeing this push-pull where he's saying indigenous people, Native Americans, belong in this lower hierarchy class. The European class is privileged. There's not much we can do about that. Native Americans are doomed to be extinct. And at the same time, he turns around and says, I see genius in Native Americans. He specifically cites some of the Cherokee and their ability to, they developed a written language from what had formerly only been a spoken language. They developed a constitution that was really similar to the American Constitution. They attempted to found their own state, and they were blocked by the state of Georgia. So he sees these things coming out of the Cherokee Nation, and he's really acknowledging, like, I see the capacity for genius in these Native American people, but at the same time he falls back into this deterministic, fatalistic mentality where the deck is stacked against them, they're not far enough along in civilization, and they're just ultimately going to be extinct by this far superior Anglo-American force that's washing in behind them. All right, so now I want to shift gears a little bit and actually talk about physical space and land occupied by Native populations. So I'll give you guys a little bit of background on some of the numbers that for 1830. So Tocqueville's visiting the U.S. at a time when the Anglo-American population's rapidly growing. In 1800, the U.S. population was about 5.3 million individuals. By 1830, the population is about 12.8 million. So census records are showing an increase of about 33% every 10 years in the number of population. And from 1800 to 1830, that means the U.S. population is more than doubling. At the same time, east of the Mississippi, there's about 105,000 Native Americans. There are several hundred thousand more west of the Mississippi, but if we think about sort of the line of where the United States has extended to in Tocqueville's time and what's really considered the frontier, we're largely talking about east of the Mississippi River. So to be clear, prior to the arrival of Europeans, all North American land was native land. In the first 2 decades of the 19th century, Native Americans saw their land base in the United States shrink by 600,000 miles, an area more than twice the size of modern-day Texas. And that is all land east of the Mississippi. So if you think about popping 2 Texases east of the Mississippi, that's about how much land was signed over in treaties in just about 20 years by Native American individuals. That's about 3.3 million square miles. Most of this lost and ceded territory is east of the Mississippi. So as the frontier continued to move west away from the Atlantic coastal regions, colonizers consistently sought greater and greater land cessions from Native Americans. Treaties superseded treaties, which superseded treaties. And we already sort of talked about that a little bit, where the government would negotiate treaties with Native American tribes, swear to uphold them, and hold the land that was promised to them out of what would be touched in the future. But we see again and again and again where the U.S. government comes back and asks over and over for more lands. And by 1830, when Tocqueville's here, we have Indian removal coming into play, and it is clear at this time that the U.S. government's intention is the expulsion of every Native American individual from land east of the western Mississippi. So to really set the stage for the Indian Removal Act of 1830, I want to back up a little bit more to the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. So after decades of conflict between the British and the French in the French and Indian War have to cede all of their claims for land in what's now the United States to the British. Coming out of this war, George III he's broke, and policing the borderlands along the colonial frontier is very expensive. So what he does is he issues this proclamation of 1763 and puts this line that essentially cuts from Nova Scotia down to Florida. Everything east of that line is open for colonization. Everything west of that line is deemed to be Indian Reserve. So that's territory that he sets aside for the exclusive use of indigenous people. But almost as soon as this happens, people start crossing that line. That line is unenforceable. So the Native Americans are told in 1763, basically everything west of the Appalachian Mountains, that's your land. We're not going to touch it. But almost immediately, colonizers start rushing forward. Colonial officials aren't interested in policing that line, and many colonial officials are actively interested in taking that land, and they become a lot of them become what are known as land speculators. So these are people who are trying to come in and buy up land or acquire land at really low cost. Then they want to subdivide it into plots, and then they want to resell it to other people and make enormous profits. And the taking of and selling of native land, particularly in areas like Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, it becomes a very, very lucrative business where there are enormous fortunes to be made. So settler society starts advancing almost as quick as this proclamation line is set. Settler society starts advancing into native homelands, trying to scoop them up and turn them into private property, into a commodity that can be assigned a dollar value and bound to a legal owner. And this is really different from how Native Americans viewed property rights and property ownership. So at this time, they are open to conversations about sharing this land and jointly occupying this land. And they don't see any one person or any one individual or society as being able to own the land. So no more than we can own the air that we breathe or the sun that shines on us, for them, you weren't able to own the land. It was a resource that was shared by everyone. So early on, and a lot of Native American communities weren't interested in immediately pushing out these colonial expansions or colonial settlements. And Tocqueville talks about that too, how they sort of lost their chance, how early on, when there were just a few number of colonists, that the indigenous people could have fought back and pushed them off their soil, but they didn't. They chose not to. And part of that comes down into this idea that land is not something that can be owned. It is not a commodity. So you have this fundamental difference in worldview from the very beginning. So the government, coming out of the French and Indian War, and especially during the American Revolution, the U.S. government, and in the War of 1812, they're pretty cash-strapped. They don't have the liquid assets to pay all the soldiers who enlist in the army. So they pay them in land warrants, primarily in land that the British had established as an Indian reserve. So all of this big chunk of land that King George III had set aside, the colonial government, during the Revolutionary War, they used that land to pay soldiers. So from the very beginning, it became very clear that this land was going to be taken by colonizers. So the U.S. government there was also effectively able to create wealth and capital where it hadn't previously existed. A majority of the soldiers that were paid in these lands weren't actually interested in relocating to the frontier. So many of the government officials who concocted the plan to pay soldiers in land turned around and then bought that land from those soldiers, and then turned around, subdivided it into further plots, and sold it at large profits to the people who did want to come into that land. There's a Tocqueville quote. It's on page 527. I want to read it to you guys about this. All right, so he talks about the disposition of the Indians often takes place today in a regular and, so to speak, entirely legal manner. That is this system of negotiating these treaties, of having these treaties in place, and then creating this like bureaucratic machine that's going to cede every square inch of native land in the United States to the United States government. This machine is not just backed by the power of diplomacy, it's backed by the power of the military. The coercion of tribal nations to keep forfeiting land rights or face violent attacks from colonizers. They were subjected to criminal proceedings, and in fact, Native people didn't really have the right to protect themselves. At the bottom of this page, he says, after giving the speech, firearms, woolen clothing, casks of brandy, glass necklaces, tin bracelets, earrings, and mirrors are spread out before the eyes of the Indians. If at the sight of all these riches they still hesitate, it is insinuated that they cannot refuse the consent demanded of them, and that soon the government itself will be unable to guarantee them enjoyment of their rights. What to do? Half persuaded, half forced, the Indians move away. They go to inhabit a new wilderness, where whites will not leave them in peace for every 10 years. It is in this way the Americans acquire at very low price the entire provinces that the richest sovereigns of Europe could not afford. So that's sort of the way that they keep coming back, treaty after treaty, taking more and more and more and more. And that's also this idea of like creating capital and wealth where it didn't previously exist. So Tocqueville moves between this argument that this native diaspora is preordained and inevitable to this argument that native removal originates from this really series of specific choices and policy choices within the U.S. government. And he does view these oftentimes with some degree of moral outrage. His belief in racial hierarchies and cultural evolution kind of allow him, though, to excuse these actions of the U.S. government, where they keep coming in and taking and renegotiating and taking. I think he excuses that, and I think he's able to do that through this concept of racial hierarchy and cultural evolution, where he does see this inevitable push of progress and civilization as being privileged. And then if we go, the last thing I want to point out on that is at the bottom of 546, he says, the conduct of Americans of the United States toward the natives radiates, in contrast, the purest love of forms and legality. That is that bureaucratic machine that the federal government was attempting to make, where you would have the treaty signing the land over, the warrants issuing the land to certain individuals, the surveying of the land, the development of deeds. They took the land through paperwork. And I think it's really interesting how Tocqueville is like pointing that out. And at the end of this, at the very bottom of page 547, he says, the Americans of the United States have achieved this double result with a marvelous ease, calmly, legally, philanthropically, without shedding blood, without violating a single one of the great principles of morality in the eyes of the world. You cannot destroy men while better respecting the laws of humanity. This world is, it must be admitted, a sad and ridiculous theater. So that's him. I see that as him struggling with the ways in which this American bureaucratic machine has taken this land, has positioned these indigenous people as outside of the scope of democracy. I think he sees that it is highly problematic, but at the same time, I think throughout the chapter, he is falling into this trap of also giving a pass because of these ideas of like racial superiority and cultural superiority. And I think it's all coming together in this really complex and somewhat disjointed way, because the expulsion is not inevitable. Tribes were exerting their own sovereignty. They negotiated, they delayed, they compromised, they resisted. And Tocqueville himself points out that there's just this machine and this mechanism in place that exists to hold them down, and as they attempt to achieve levels of supposed civilization and attempt to integrate and function within the democratic system, that system in turn pushes them back out and doesn't recognize their role within American democracy. So, thank you.